Right. So just to give a bit of background, I'm talking about preparing for difficult conversations. So it's not actually about the difficult conversation itself. And part of it is based on, well, some of the things that I'm saying are repeats of what was said at a TGIF meeting in May, where some of you were present and you'll recognize some of the things that I'm going to say. But also, I have read this book, Conflicted, Why Arguments Are Tearing Us Apart and How That Can Bring Us Together. And that is also one of my resources. And then otherwise, there's from all over the place, but those are the two biggest ones. So yesterday, I read Romans 12 again, especially verse 18, which says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And when I read that, there were two things that came to mind. The one was conflict will happen. So if possible, as far as it depends on you, assumes that conflicts will happen, and we don't always have that possibility to live peaceably with all. There are conflicts that just happen because we're in a fallen world. And then this live peaceably with all sort of stumped me for a while, because I was going, okay, now what does this actually mean? Does this mean that we should be avoiding conflict and that we shouldn't be having difficult conversations? Why am I giving this talk? Should I just say, oh, no, just avoid conflict at all costs? That's what it's about. And I don't believe that is what this verse is saying. So for a number of reasons, and I think there are a lot more than what I'm mentioning here. But first of all, if we look at Jesus' example, if you actually read the Gospels from the point of view of looking at the kind of conversations that Jesus has with people, it's actually amazing how provocative he is. He does not have easy conversations with people. He often actually starts a difficult conversation. If you look at, I just looked at John at the beginning of John, in verse 2, even the wedding in Cana, his mother asks him to get him involved. And his response is, woman, why do you involve me? Which, as a mother, I would find fairly provocative. Then, just carrying on further on the chapter, Jesus clears the temple courts, creating a big conflict situation. In chapter 3, in his conversation with Nicodemus, he says, you are Israel's teacher, and do you not understand these things? Again, put yourself into Nicodemus' position. He was a teacher, so he really thought that he knew what was going on. And to be told, do you really understand? So I think for me, what this short look at John has done is that I actually really want to do a study of the different Gospels and see what kind of conversations did Jesus have, because there really are many conflict situations there. And what is it that he was talking about? What did he think was worth diving into a difficult conversation about? So that's the one reason. And then Jesus himself, he says, I am the truth, the way, and the life. So he didn't say, I am the mask, I am the pretense. He said, I am the truth. And if we as Christians love the truth in the same way as he demonstrates to us and as he shows that truth is important, then the truth matters, and we will find ourselves as a result of in conflict situations. And then lastly, just briefly, I mean, Jesus came as a mediator into the conflict situation between us and God. So those are just briefly 3 reasons why I do think that we need to be involved in conflict situations or in conflict conversations, difficult ones. So if I say yes, I do think that we should be involved, then what does live peaceably with all actually mean? I think that it means that we need to be engaging in difficult conversations in a peaceable way. And a clue as to how we do that is to look at the beginning of Romans. It tells us Romans 12 itself, which tells us to be a living sacrifice. It tells us about humility, love, generosity. And if I translate that, then I would say we are called to respond to another's need in the middle of a conflict situation with love, humility, and generosity. And that's really where we're going to go. I'd like to really explore how can you do this. And I would suggest that we start by beginning with some introspection before God. And the roadmap to what we're covering today, since I don't have a PowerPoint, is We're going to start with looking at our attitude to conflict, then at our patterns of behavior in conflict situations, and lastly, actually preparing for a specific situation. So, what are our attitudes like? What words do we use when we talk about conflict situations? Please give me some words, some phrases. I can start us off. How about demolish the argument? Give me some more. What?
You never, you always.
You never, you always, right? What other words do we use, or how do we describe conflict situations?
I really don't have time for this.
We're laughing because it's us, right?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose the question is, when do you have time for this? Anyone else want to add?
How can you say this?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nonsense.
Nonsense, okay.
All stronger variations there.
We would also say something like, I attacked his weakest point, shot down my idea, your claims are indefensible. And can you hear that in the way that we talk about these kinds of conversations, we're actually using battle terminology. The metaphors that we use are quite strong, and we label things nonsense or not worthy of our time. And I think what that points to is that we often find these conversations threatening, and that we are on the defensive, that we get involved, that we fight it out. And I think there's a difference between seeing something as a threat and seeing something as a challenge. So if we have a look at our attitudes, is it possible to actually change our attitude from seeing something as a threat to going, yes, it is a challenge, but a challenge is something we can develop skills for, we're up for it. A threat is something that we really feel we need to protect ourselves from or run away from. So that's the words we use. What about the results that we expect? What do you expect if you're going to go into a difficult conversation, or somebody starts talking about something personally with you and you're just like, oh, I didn't want to talk about this. Where does your mind go? What results could you expect?
So how do you mean, Vera? Yes,
so what?
That they'll discover I'm right.
Oh, they'll discover that I'm right. Okay. Okay.
But I think you're looking for a platform for dialogue and discussion. Ideally.
Right. So that could be a positive result.
Right.
It can lead to positive.
I want to
It's
change
just
you.
So
That's
would-
all.
yeah. So you expect to be able to change somebody, and sometimes the other people come in wanting to change you.
Always,
Yeah.
Which creates a conflict.
Right.
My default is, how do I quickly get out of this safely and run away?
Yeah. No, that's very insightful. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the what we personally do, our habitual responses in situations like that. So, do you expect it to go well? Do you expect the result of this conversation to be a better relationship with the person? Or do we expect something else?
To just win that argument.
I think you would like it to go well, but there's always this anxiety that you know it's not going to go well.
Right. So actually the anxiety that you know it's not going to go well, so you're actually really leaning towards expecting the negative often. Right.
It's almost like we place our own truth before the relationship, in the sense that it's more important to be right than actually to have.
Sure.
I see that a lot in families.
Yeah.
that I'm right, but that's actually more important to just be able to relate to the person.
Yeah.
And then to establish a superiority either intellectually or morally or whatever in the argument.
Okay, so
So
the
that the other
argument,
person is less than.
the argument is actually going to establish the hierarchy.
Right.
And this is how it's going to go from here onwards. If I'm right, then from now onwards you know I'm right and you're not going to argue with me. Right, okay.
Can I ask a question? So in a difficult, I'm hearing we're looking from the perspective of I have to have a difficult conversation with you. But you don't think you're unaware that I'm needing to have a difficult.
Yeah.
So So what happens to that person, the person who like shows up and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a difficult
Someone
conversation.
blindsided.
And they're like, whoa, I didn't know that this was happening. Is that, I don't know.
Well, it could
I
be
hear we're talking about the person who's having to prepare for the debate.
Yeah, but the other person is there. Yeah. And how do they experience that?
Yeah.
You know, suddenly having a difficult conversation that they didn't expect. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just catching up a little bit on. I'm trying to invite Zoom people. You're welcome to unmute and speak. But so I'm catching up on one or two of your comments. So one is I expect to be shut down, and the other one is I expect to understand the other person better and to be heard properly.
Okay.
Two lightings.
Right. So that's actually one of the few more positive results. And often we come expecting that there's going to be relational tension once we start a conflict situation, or there's going to actually be estrangement. You know, there's going to be more distance between us. If there is a coffee going, I'm very happy to drink it.
Oh, sorry.
I ordered a cappuccino, but
I had yours.
But you don't have to. If
No,
there is one.
go ahead and we'll have the two lattes.
We ordered two lattes and we came.
That's why you don't leave. No,
Have it on us. Sure.
we'll have a difficult conversation later.
Okay, hang on. I was just going to say that sometimes it results in physical violence.
I like that.
What do you mean?
So,
It's really-
but in his book, Ian Leslie says, you know, we can also expect positive results. So, so the one that was mentioned, he actually looks at 3 areas. The one is, could conflict bring us closer? Could conflict make us smarter? And could conflict make us more creative? So if we have a look at bringing us closer, this is, you know, really going against what we expect, because we've had experiences where having those difficult conversations just brings tensions. But he says a conflict situation can make it possible for you to hear the other person again. Because often in long-term relationships, we tend to think, oh, we know that person, and we actually end up boxing them in a specific box and stereotyping them. And, you know, saying, oh, well, we're reading their mind, we know what they're going to say, and we don't actually hear what they really do say. And in a conflict situation, what they say, or they decide it's important enough to be heard, and they actually bring it up. So a conflict updates our mental model of the other person and can result in bringing us closer, because we then realize who the other person really is. It also shows what you care about.
Yes.
Conflict situations are those that you actually, you know, if you care enough about something to stand up for it, to say something about it, then it shows what you care about, and you can learn about the other person, what they care about, what's important to them. So it can also bring you closer in that way, if you think about it from that perspective. I was thinking in Acts, in Jerusalem, in Acts 11, in Jerusalem, when the circumcised believers criticized Peter for eating with the uncircumcised men, then that conversation resulted in Gentiles and Jews being brought closer together. So we can actually see that happening in the early church as well. I think one of the needs that one has to know that there is a commitment to have this kind of conflict conversation that can bring you closer. There needs to be a commitment to the relationship underlying.
I think as well we have the tendency, we want to sort people out on the spot. And you have to recognize, you have to have the patience, and you have to have the engagement, and sometimes and all of these nice things that you speak about, and all of these necessary things, they're not going to happen if you want to resolve the issue right there and then.
And you need to have the maybe respect of recognizing it will take a while, and sometimes they're tactical retreats or whatever the case is, but it takes a while. It's not a once-off sorting out.
Yeah, and I think what's key to that is the fact that what Natalie said earlier about the person being more important than actually being right. So then you give it time, because you don't have this immediate need to prove that you are right. And it's about commitment to the relationship, and that context makes it possible. Yeah. So that's how conflict can bring us closer. What about how can conflict make us smarter? So here, I think it also there's a need that needs to be underlying. It needs the right environment of constructive disagreement and appreciation for truth. So it's not about an environment where there's personal attack happening. It needs to be about a commitment to actually getting to the truth of the matter, and it needs to be constructive. And if you have that kind of environment, then it's possible to actually gain from others' perspectives and to donate your own perspective. And with that donation of different perspectives, you actually unlock the benefits of diversity. So together, you can actually think more, you can be smarter, you can develop what he calls interactive intelligence, which I quite like.
Yes.
Because I often, a lot of my work is in conversation, and I think that people really, they often get to a point much faster and a better point through interaction than what they get if somebody's just telling them what to do and think. And what it also counters is this groupthink, where everybody's just thinking the same thing. If you actually invite participation from people who think differently and invite different opinions and are okay with a little bit of tension, a little bit of conflict, then you avoid groupthink, and also you avoid your own confirmation bias from just setting in. And then there's also something called shared information bias, which is about assuming that everybody else has the same information that you have, and they're not actually saying anything, because you assume that everybody shares that information. But if you don't assume that, and you're open to having different points of view shared, then you can get further, and you can be smarter. And the last one about creativity. So creativity is often encouraged through brainstorming. Just let's brainstorm and come up with all these different ideas. But what they've measured is that if everybody is encouraged to give their idea, and you just have this platform where you say, no idea is bad, let's just have all ideas out there, then you get to quite a few ideas. But if you actually allow a robust debate of those ideas, and you allow people to say, hey, but that one isn't going to work, obviously this is going to happen. And then when the person is actually encouraged to think a little bit further, they can come up with the next better idea. So in some of the business contexts, they found that being open to criticizing the ideas, if you have the right environment again, can actually bring you to a more creative space. And here I think the needs are that you need to have mutual trust of each other. You need to, again, trust that you're not going to be personally attacked for bringing your ideas. And you need to have a common goal. So that goal of we're going to achieve this thing together, and we're committing to achieving that goal, that draws us together and makes it possible for us to also disagree. And what this kind of interaction does is it reveals what is hidden under the surface. So if we just don't have the conflict situation, everybody just keeps a mask on their face, then the crucial information, the actual reasons for what's going on, the insights that are underneath, can remain hidden, which then means that, we might have great ideas, but they're actually not going to solve the problem. But if we can get this kind of environment going, then it fulfills the creative potential, again, of diversity of the people in the room. So it takes a bit of a mind shift for us to think this way, because we tend to, go, oh no, it's not safe. But if we can actually do our bit to create the kind of environment where this can happen, then we can be more creative and we can be smarter. So an example with the creativity that I thought of in Acts as well is when the Hellenistic Jews, when the widows were overlooked, they brought that up. They didn't just leave it. And if they'd left it, it would have festered. They would have had, a split probably between the Gentiles and the Jews, but bringing it up made it possible for them to come up with a creative solution of having deacons for the first time, and that they were responsible. So, and then in terms of making us smarter, just to go back to that, if you look at a lot of the interactions that Jesus has with the disciples, they sort of push the disciples to a place where they actually then in John 6 go, you have the words of eternal life. And I think that is getting us smarter to realize, things fall into place. So those would be two examples there. And then in terms of other results that we expect, I think that we can really expect Christian growth from conflict conversations. And I'm not sure that we can find as good a place for Christian growth as this. So in one sense, it helps us to face our own sin. And of course, we need to be very open and humble about that. We could be wrong, and we could be, in a conflict situation, we could be the one who's actually doing harm to other people. So it helps us to come face to face with that, with our own sin. And it also actually develops the fruit of the Spirit in us. And if we are living on our own and we are never in contact with anybody, and we, just have an easy life, we have wonderful fruits of the Spirit, don't we? We're amazing people. We're so patient, and, but when we're with others, we have those kind of conflicts. It actually develops that skill, that fruit. Sorry, it's not really a skill. Okay, so that is the results that we can expect. And then what I think also influences our attitude to conflict is our personal experiences of conflict. And I think that's, a lot of what's sitting in the room, what we are experiencing about this. And we go, I don't know if I can shift. And that's because of the fact that we've had personal experiences. So if we are looking at how to handle conflict more positively, then we do need to do a bit of inside work and go back to, so what kind of conflicts did we experience before that have formed this picture, this way of behaving? And that would be looking at our families of origin, looking at what kind of conflicts we experienced as children in school and the playground, the cultural conflicts that we've experienced, and then also looking at what kind of roles things like different ages played. Did we have conflicts with people who were older than us, or do we have conflicts with people that are younger than us? What role does rank play in those kinds of conversations? So the previous ones that we've had, what role does gender play? Have we had a tendency to always be in conflict with the opposite gender? And what role does our faith play as well in terms of our personal experiences of conflict? Have we been encouraged to avoid it because we've been told anger is wrong and it's a sin, and you don't have conflict situations, you just be quiet and bear it patiently. So joyfully. So I do think in thinking about this, in preparing for conflict situations, in being better prepared, it is useful to do some personal work to experience healing in specific areas or around specific relationships, and to extend forgiveness to others. And I think the problem is, if we don't do this, what we find is that we often reenact our conflict situations again and again. And this is, whether we were on the receiving end or whether we were on the giving end, we have a tendency to just reenact them. And we find then that we have this gap between the way that we want to behave in difficult situations and the way that we actually behave. So, this brings to mind Romans 6, of being in that rut of just not behaving the way that we want to. And this results often in us carrying a lot of shame, and the shame actually often reinforces the bad behavior we're trying to get rid of. So it really is a good idea to do some of that inside work. And the next point I'd like to look at is understanding my patterns of behavior in different conversations. So we've covered our attitudes, now we're having a look at our actual behavior. And what I find useful is to think about what makes a conversation difficult for me to begin with. So what is it in that specific situation? Is it something that's happening, or is it something that isn't happening? Or is it something about the consequences of what's going on that makes that situation a situation that's difficult? Is it the relationships that I'm involved in there? So some people will say, well, I find it more difficult to be in a conflict conversation with somebody that I really, really care about, because there's so much more at stake. What if this goes wrong in that relationship? But other people might say, no, I find it very difficult to be in a conflict situation at work, because those relationships, the consequences of actually having a bad relationship there could mean that I'll end up losing my job. Again, looking at like, what about rank? Do I find this conversation difficult because of me having to look up to somebody and having to always do what they say and they're in charge? Or is it a conversation that's difficult because the person who is ranked below me is not agreeing with what I'm saying? So it could be that, or just also to look at, what about the conversations between equals? Am I able to have conversations there that are useful? And then also emotions is a big thing. So, have we classified specific emotions as unacceptable? That those are the kind of emotions we don't express in public. Because we will become emotionally involved in a conflict situation. That's to be expected. If we care about what we're talking about, if we're invested in any way, then our emotions will be involved. And we will have to deal with our own emotions, but also with the other person's emotions. So what is it that it makes it difficult for us? Is it our own emotion that we haven't actually worked through, or is it the other person's emotion that we just don't know how to handle? And really what I'm looking at here is also your triggers. What if you know what kinds of things are going to be more likely to get you angry or to get you upset, then you can also be more prepared for conversations, because you have more of an idea when you're going to have one. And I think if you take it to the next level in terms of what makes a conversation difficult for me, if you take it down further, then you can really question, what have I invested my identity in? What is so important that it leads to a difficult conversation? And if you really, ask deeply, what are my idols here? Another way that we can look at the way that we have conversations is, what conversation level do we have a tendency to focus on? Because we're different, but it seems like there are two different levels of conversations. The one is the content level, what is actually said. So the words that are used. And the other level is the relationship level. So the more of the non-verbal, how can I interpret this conversation? What effect is it going to have on our relationship? So that's more of the relationship level. And we tend to focus on one more strongly than the other. And a way of then trying to do things a little bit differently in our conflict conversations is to pay attention to the other side. So if we are somebody who really looks at the content usually, to try and train ourselves to look at the non-verbal, to pay attention to it and to try and engage with what's going on underneath the words as well as the words themselves, and to ask questions that actually would go there. And if we are people who focus on the relationship level, then we would need to look at what is actually being said, to bring ourselves back to that. And sometimes also to realize that the non-verbal might not actually be about us. So not to take the non-verbal personally. The person that we're involved in might just have had a bad night's sleep. So they might be gazing out, not focusing on you, not because of something that's not about you. It's just about them and what they're going through themselves. So another question to ask is, in what situations do I think that I can read the other person's mind? So where is this happening? Have I stereotyped the other person? Or, what boxes do I tend to use to stereotype other people, and to explore that? And then looking at specific behavior patterns that we tend to fall into that might not be helpful. If you are somebody who avoids, avoiding the person, avoiding the situation, do you put on a mask to pretend that everything's fine, or do you actually just give one of those white lies when somebody says, what's going on, what's wrong? You go, so it's a good idea to try and identify what you are actually doing in situations. Are you shutting down? Are you zoning out, or are you a blank slate that just doesn't contribute anymore in a conflict situation? Do you become sarcastic? Do you try and control the situation or the other person? And this can be in an authoritarian way or a manipulative way. Those words that came up earlier, never and always, those are definitely ways to try and control.
Always.
So you have a tendency to dredge up the past and to, hold previous incidences that have happened, previous conversations or previous disagreements over the other person. Is there unforgiveness that you need to deal with? Do you react from your gut? As in, do you lose your temper or shout or become emotionally abusive? Are you somebody who shames the others? Do you call them names? Do you set yourself above them and feel that you're better than them because you're not getting involved in the conflict situation? So do you take everything personally?
Yeah.
And then feel that you have to really defend yourself, but actually you feel like you're the victim. And do you take on that role? So it is useful to just look at
You can title this as ouch or amen. This one.
Multiple options.
So I think so trying to change the way that we behave in the middle of difficult conversations needs us to first really acknowledge what's going on and how we are behaving. Okay, and then lastly, looking at preparing for a specific situation. I think the first important question to ask is really, what is the pressing issue here? So what makes this important to me? And why is it important right now? So before you actually launch into a conversation, if you feel that there's something going on, it's helpful to ask yourself those questions. And then also, is it going to be worth it? And here, it's really a good idea to investigate why. Why is this conversation going to be worth it? What is the pleasure or the positive outcome that could happen out of addressing it? And what is the positive outcome if I don't address it? What could be the pain or the negative outcome of addressing it? And what could be the negative outcome of just leaving things as they are? So it's a good idea to just weigh it up before you actually launch into a conversation. And then I think a lot of what we said before can just be specifically applied to a conversation. So things like checking your assumptions before you go into the conversation. What judgments are you bringing into this conversation? You might be making an assumption that this is about something else than what that it actually seems to be, because you might be taking something personally. So just check what are your assumptions as you go in. What stereotypes could be playing out? So who does the other person represent to me? Have I stereotyped them? But at the same time, who do I represent to them? Have they maybe got a stereotype around me, or could I, just by who I am, actually represent somebody else that I don't want to at all? There is that dynamic going on in the conversation as well. And then in terms of the importance, we've looked at how important is this conversation to me, but how important is it going to be to them? There might also be a bit of a mismatch there in terms of also, if you've got different levels of importance, then there's also different levels of commitment to resolving the issue. For somebody it might be, this isn't an issue, so why should we have this conversation? I'll just retreat quickly. It would also be helpful to think about what specific triggers of mine are likely to be evoked in the situation. So it can be useful to actually imagine what's going to happen. How could they react? Could they react by blaming me and by defending themselves, by crying, by becoming angry? So what kind of things could I expect, and what could I actually do in those situations? And also to give a bit of thought to what the other person's patterns of behavior in conflict situations could be. If you know the person, then perhaps you know what's likely to happen. So you can also, after you've explored your own, you can also just think about, okay, that person is likely to do that. That would probably trigger me in this way. So what am I going to do? How am I going to perform this one? And this really brings us to deciding to focus on the other person's needs, which I mentioned in the beginning. So that would be making a decision to not take things personally, to practice self-control, to use self-regulation when I feel like I'm getting more tense and ready to explode. It means giving grace to the other person, recognizing that probably there is frustration that is built up around this issue in them before this conversation. It's not just a conversation that's isolated, that comes out of nowhere. There's a history. And then to also make a decision to listen for their pain. Because often there is underlying pain in our conflict situations from previous conversations or from previous hurts that we've been involved in together or from other people. And to really listen, to understand, to be curious about what's actually going on. When this person says something, even when it's an emotional kind of outburst, to make a decision beforehand that I'm not going to, bombard or explode. I'm actually going to try and find out what's going on underneath. So in terms of timing, I think, if it's at all possible, if you are the person who's going to initiate a conversation and you have the choice of when to do it, then it would be good to just check in with yourself, be self-aware. Am I in a good place to start this conversation? If there's a whole lot of other stressful things happening in my life right now, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just wait. If I'm, on the edge of burnout, then yeah, it's not a good time. And then try and have the conversation face to face. Really, it's much easier to have it face to face because you can see so much more. You can focus on the nonverbal and not just on the verbal. And there's just so many levels of interaction that are possible face to face. And then, of course, I think this is obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, is have the conversation privately, one-on-one, not in a public space, not with a whole, in a meeting with a whole crowd. Then journal writing can be quite helpful in terms of preparation. So this would be helpful to process your own emotions, to flesh out your goal, the ideal that you actually want to achieve, what you want above what you don't want. So focus on what it is that you actually want to achieve, where you want to go, and not what you don't want. So what do you want to change? What is the goal of having this conversation? And imagine the positive. And then this can be useful in resolving your inner conflict around the conversation as well, because you will have an inner conflict. If it comes up in the middle of the conversation, it's going to be so much harder to deal with. If you've sorted it through beforehand, then you'll be in a better place. And also to just clearly describe or articulate the situation. Journaling can be helpful to just put it down and actually see, well, this is clearly what's going on. And afterwards to read through what you've said, what you've written, which gives you the option to then look at what is your attitude that you're bringing into this conversation. Look at it from a different perspective. Pretend it wasn't you who wrote that. And what kind of language do you use? What labels are you using? And and then the last thing would be, don't discuss it with others. Don't gossip before these conversations. I do think, I suppose, also just being a coach, I think it is useful to speak through it with a coach or a spiritual advisor beforehand. But I have, in situations where I wasn't in that kind of role, I have been through situations where people have spoken to me about a conflict situation, and I've sort of tried to go, look, I don't think this is the right thing. I don't think you should be talking to me. I think you need to go and speak to them. And they just have not stopped. And then when I've checked up afterwards with them, well, have you spoken? They go, no, I felt so much better after I spoke to you. I didn't go and speak. And it didn't feel like the right thing, the right choice. So I really do think it is a good idea to not talk about all our conflict situations out there, but to be very intentional about where and how we speak about them. And that's all I have to say. So thanks.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not easy. I know it does take some personal work. Yeah. Any questions?
Jumping in on your last, sorry, that's good.
There's a mic. Sorry.
Oh,
No, just point it to the person and I'll be okay. By the way, questions means questions to Zoom or people in the room.
Yeah, Vera, thank you so much. Incredibly rich and textured and many takeaways. Jumping in on your last point, and it deals with certain types of conflict. But I was thinking more of the antagonism or organizational antagonism factors of dealing with conflict. And sometimes it's recommended that while you may be aware of a particular issue, you need to wait till someone else in the organization is also aware of it. So it's along with your point, don't go in without consulting with somebody, either a coach or having somebody that you can sound off to ahead of time and get perspective as far as that's concerned. What do you think of that?
So that's quite difficult, because if you never mention it, then you probably won't ever know if anybody else has actually, discovered it. So, but if you have any influence on the type of environment that this gets raised in, I think it would be important to first create an environment where those kinds of things can be talked about. Where and if you are in a leadership position, then you're raising something also actually gives permission to other people to raise other issues. So I'm not quite sure that you need to always wait. It probably depends on your rank in the organization.
Yes.
Yeah, where that plays out.
Right on.
Yeah, and again, in terms of what I said about speaking one-on-one to somebody, then I think that's where you would start. You would then think about which person would be the first person to raise this with, and try it. Yeah. Okay.
Is there more conflict in our modern world?
Something new under the sun.
Well, I think that's very, very difficult to answer. I mean, if you think about wars, then wars, there was so
talking on personal. Do we deal with more conflict now than we did in the past? Is conflict getting more, and is it escalating, or is it a personal thing?
I think it's very difficult to make that judgment, because we're comparing something where we didn't have news, media, internet measurements, in the past, with something where we do have that now. So I think that our conflicts have become more public, but I'm not sure whether necessarily our conflicts have become more, but there are new challenges in our conflicts. So for example, in terms of the mixing of different cultures, we are much more mixed now. And some cultures are much more focusing on the non-verbal kind of communication. There's I'm just involved in a mediation in Japan, which is actually very interesting, because they talk about reading the air. So you don't even read the non-verbal, you read the air. It's a very, very indirect culture, and you don't have direct confrontations. And we are so much more mixed now, with people from all cultures having living in Japan and working with each other, or a lot of online conversations, online work happening. So I think there is, and if you think about the American culture, which is much more direct and out there, then you can see that it can lead to a different level of interaction, a different level of conflict. So I'm not sure that I'm really answering. I think it's a very
You never answered it. You basically said we are dealing with it.
I think there was a lot more oppression in earlier days. So people didn't have a voice. I mean, ladies didn't have the vote, and they weren't allowed to express themselves in the family as strongly as they do these days.
Yeah.
I think it's a time thing.
So the conflicts were there.
Yes, correct.
But they were not experienced in the same way. They weren't open.
I don't think there's more there. I think there's nothing new under the sun.
Human
nature. It's always been human nature since Adam and Eve fell.
I was going to say, just reading through the Bible, we go back to the Old Testament.
Same stuff we do.
Exactly.
All of these things are just repeating themselves.
Yeah, I mean, in the garden, you're at fault. It started there. Yeah, you had your hand up.
Yes, so I'm just also, this is a bit of a trial run to see if we can have a Zoom question. So Delene, go for it.
Hi, morning Vera. Hi everyone.
Hi.
Very clear.
Yes, we can hear you. Great.
Thanks Vera for a really very insightful talk again. And I just wanted to ask, you said you were uncomfortable with someone actually chatting with you and not directly speaking with the person that they wanted to have the conversation with. But is there perhaps a benefit in it in that if you speak to a trusted other, you may actually be able to reach a different perspective, perhaps just have a different insight, or perhaps by verbalizing it, realize that perhaps it's not necessary to have that conversation, and not because you're backing out, but because you've thought, well, you've actually, sometimes it's just, I think, helpful to say things, and then you realize, oh my goodness, that doesn't sound so good now, does it? And you may not need to have the conversation, not because you're chickening out. So, and I'm not talking about gossiping to someone else, but it may also put a heavy on you. So the person who you're speaking to, you should perhaps ask permission of them, that they don't carry that burden.
Yeah, now, I can see the value in that. I think so. I think what you just said is very important, asking permission, because that person didn't actually have my permission. I kept on saying, I don't think you should be talking to me about this. That was, so they did not have my permission. And I in that situation, and I think this is the when you speak about a specific situation like I just did, I have the whole context, and I know that in that situation it wasn't the right thing to do. But I do think that there are situations where, if it's somebody like a spiritual advisor or someone that you really trust, that you've got that relationship with, and that they are going to help you to work through your own issues in the situation. I think that would be an important part, and that they are going to hold you accountable to actually address it with the other person if it's necessary. So I think those would be part of the conversation. But I think one has to be careful about who one speaks to, and one should probably also speak to somebody who is not that close to the situation. I mean, this was my problem. I was very close as well. And it's So in that situation, it just really didn't feel right. And it felt like my listening had actually just given the person an opportunity to vent, but actually not to deal with the conflict with the other. So every situation is different, and one needs to think carefully about each one. Okay.
Vera, I just have an observation. Your thoughts on this. I don't know about everybody else, but certainly sitting here, I was filtering what you had to say. And by the way, it was excellent, as Fred said. Thank you. I was filtering it in terms of two contexts. One, marriage. I've been married for 34 years, and there are still conflicts. My wife constantly tells me it's better to be kind than to be right, and I don't get that. So, I'm working on I'm joking. But more so marriage, and then the other context, of course, is business. And you'll know the book. I've forgotten the title, but the book was written by the two guys that started Gallup, which do all the polls. So they wrote a book on, of all the polls Gallup has run throughout the world, what were the most important business lessons. And the one that has always remained with me is that the number one reason that good people leave an organization is the relationship with their direct boss. Doesn't matter how much you pay them, what their benefits are, they will leave if their boss is a jerk. Or if they're the jerk and the relationship is bad for that reason, they will leave the organization. So I'm just, as a coach, I'm interested in do you have thoughts on that? Because how do we as Christians respond in an environment where we perhaps have conflict with a boss? I don't ever want to be that guy, the boss that causes someone to leave my company. I'm just interested in your thoughts. There's no question here.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things in coming into any conflict situation is that we have to recognize that we can't come in changing the other person or wanting to change the other person. And that is the reality of the situation. So if I am working for a jerk, then I can just look at my side and my own internal conflicts and how I behave in those situations and try and keep it as clean as possible. So I think that would be my first step. And I can understand how somebody would get to the point where they say, well, it's just, too much.
So does that coming to that point, does that assume that you've already gone in, closed the door, and had a one-on-one?
Yeah. So I would follow.
And it's not working. You just say, okay, I'm out of here.
Yeah. So I would follow those principles. I think the biblical principles that are used inside the church of go by yourself first and then take another. I think those apply to the business environment as well.
Sandal steel teeth. 7 times.
The thing is that whichever way it goes, I think some people would be convicted to stay because they feel like they have a positive influence on the environment to other people, and some people will be convicted to go. And I don't think that one can assume that either way is a rule is right. Full stop.
Right.
I think each person needs to look at themselves and their own capacity, and also to think and if you're in that situation, you need to know that you are going to have to deal with your own issues a lot because they are going to be brought up, and to be open to doing that again and again.
And one thing we haven't spoken about, but it's kind of obvious, is that one of the first things we should do is pray about it. So even before you close the door and go into your boss and have that conversation, you should have been asking the Lord for all of the things that you've been mentioning, right?
Yeah, no, that's why I said we need to do this before God. Is this internal investigation? Is there? Sorry, I think Torsten's got something from.
Yeah. So it's how many more people in the room?
Yeah.
You have.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man. All right. So there's at least 2 questions on Zoom, but let's try and get through them all. We have 4 minutes.
I think in my case, it's just the issue about having conflict not with a person, but with an institution. And that can be anything from the government dealing with home affairs, like at the rules at work, that kind of thing, because it doesn't have a face. So it's just a comment. It's like, and that's where I'm very good at conflict resolution, but I lose it when I'm dealing with conflict where I don't have a counterpart to actually engage with. I'm happy to engage with them quietly and sort of diplomatically and everything.
Sometimes I think it does help to try and work out, is there a face? Because sometimes there is a face. If we have a specific, like, oh no, the government has done this and this, if we actually, and we need to have the time and the motivation to do this, if we start digging, we may find there actually is a person and that we can try and, but it needs editing. But yeah. Do you want to give one from Zoom?
Yeah, let me just, okay, I'm still figuring out the microphone thing, so apologies if it doesn't work perfectly. No, that's for that. I'm apologizing to the Zoom people. So there was a question here from Barent. Thanks, Vera. Question: the most difficult conversations for me are those where the other person is just not willing to engage and puts up all sorts of defenses to avoid talking about something I would like to put on the table. Any advice?
So I think one of the things that we need to realize when that happens is that we have had time to prepare. So for us, this has been an issue that's been long-standing. We've thought through it. We've probably worked through some of our own emotions, but when we come and bring it to somebody else, it might have caught them completely by surprise. So I think giving grace to that person to actually have the same time, well, obviously they can't have exactly the same time, but to give them time to say, look, I'd like to have a conversation with you about this topic, and I'd like to give you time to prepare. Then when can we have it? That might help. instead of just, walking in, closing the door and saying, I want to have this conversation with you about this and right now. I think that would be one principle that I would follow. And to maybe even phrasing, say, look, I realize this may come to you out of the blue, but it is something that's important to me. And I think also to emphasize the relationship, the fact that, talking this through will be good for us and it will make things clearer between us and I can see a positive end. So, I think those are a few things.
Okay, and then we still had Christine. Christine, speak. I think we can hear you.
I'm not sure I can hear you.
We can.
Thanks very much, Vera. I really enjoyed the talk. It's very applicable to me. But I just wanted to ask in 1 Corinthians 6 about the fighting between Christians ending up in lawsuits. And in the end, it says, well, this is in the Living Bible, it says to have such lawsuits at all is a real defeat for you as Christians. Why do you not just accept mistreatment and leave it at that? What is your view on that?
So I think there's there are also other passages which I think advise us to have a mediator. But I think that what I said in the beginning was, the whole emphasis on Romans 12 really applies. So we need to come into these situations being willing to be the living sacrifice, to be humble, to be generous. And what was the other one? So to love. Yeah. That's terrible. So I think that needs to be our first, our commitment, that in these situations that's what we are going to commit to. And I think it is really hard in our current culture because those things are not encouraged. We are encouraged to really stand up for our rights and to, make sure that things are happening the way that they should be in terms of justice. But I think we need to be, are we becoming selfish in the way that we're doing things? And the other thing that I think is important, and specifically in this situation, is that this went into the legal court, which means that there was a whole development around how the people around saw the Christian church and the impact that it had on the gospel and how things got seen there. So yes, I don't think that it applies just to every single situation, but I do think that we need to check ourselves in terms of what is this about? Is this about me being right, or is this about the relationship? And I think that opens up a whole different conversation around justice, because I do think that people who are really sinning and that they should actually have the consequences of their sin. So I don't think, like if it was like an abuse situation or rape, that kind of thing, I would say, no, that has to go to court. That's not the kind of mediation that you go, well, this is a conflict situation. So I think one has to really think carefully about that. Okay. Right. So
that was back and forth between Thorsten and I trying to figure out who's going to close it up. Thank you, Vera.
Yes. And everybody else.